The rumble of 18 wheels beneath you becomes a sort of white noise after a while. 10 years hauling freight across the Midwest, and I've learned to find comfort in that constant vibration. I've been driving the same Peterbilt 389 since 2015, crisscrossing Ohio and the surrounding states more times than I could possibly count. Most people think that truck driving is boring. They picture endless stretches of highway, the same sights over and over. And sure, yeah, there's plenty of that. But what they don't realize is that the road is a way of showing you things that don't make any sense in the light of day. I've kept a journal of sorts over the years. Started as notes in my phone, things that I didn't want to forget. Now it's become something of an obsession, documenting the unexplainable things that I've witnessed on these lonely highways. I'm not saying that I believe in the supernatural. I'm just saying that I can't explain everything that I've seen. Let me tell you about some of them. This happened about 8 years ago, somewhere along I-70 eastbound. It was early October and Ohio was showing off with those brilliant fall colors. I was hauling automotive parts from Indianapolis to Columbus, a route that I had driven maybe 100 times before. It was around 3 a.m., that dead zone when your eyelids get heavy and the coffee's worn off, but you've still got hours to go. The road was practically empty, just me and the occasional passenger car every 20 minutes or so. I remember checking my mirrors and seeing nothing but darkness behind me when I passed mile marker 347. That's when my headlights caught her. A woman standing on the shoulder, thumb out like she was hitching a ride, in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning. She wore a blue sundress, completely inappropriate for the 40-degree night, and had this long, dark hair that whipped around her face in the wind. No luggage, no purse, nothing. Just standing there, staring directly at me as I passed. I'm not in the habit of picking up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of the night, but something about her sent a chill up my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. And the second that it took for my truck to pass her, I swear she never blinked, just stared with these hollow eyes that seemed to follow me. The rational part of my brain started making excuses. Maybe she had car trouble, maybe she was walking to the next exit. But that didn't explain the inappropriate clothing or why she was out there alone in the first place. I radioed it in to any other truckers in the area, thinking that somebody should check if she needed help. 2 other drivers responded that they had just passed that same section of highway and hadn't seen any woman. I might have convinced myself that I was hallucinating from fatigue, except for what happened next. About 20 miles down the road, I pulled into a rest stop to use the bathroom and grab a fresh coffee. As I was walking back to my truck, coffee in hand, I glanced at the cab of my Peterbilt. There she was, the same woman sitting in the passenger seat of my locked truck, just sitting there staring straight ahead, hands folded in her lap. I dropped my coffee and fumbled for my keys, but by the time that I got the door open, the cab was empty. No sign that anybody had been there. No wet footprints, no indentation in the seat, nothing. I didn't sleep for the rest of that haul, and I still get goosebumps when I drive past mile marker 347. I've never seen her again, but other truckers have stories about a woman in a blue dress along that stretch. Some say she was killed by a hit-and-run driver back in the 80s. Others say that she's been appearing on that road since the 1950s. All I know is what I saw, and I still can't explain it. This one's been happening on and off for years, and it's not just me. Ask any trucker who regularly drives through eastern Ohio about the midnight conversation and you'll see their face change. It always happens after midnight, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., and almost exclusively on rural stretches of highway where you don't expect much CB traffic. It starts off with static and then a voice comes through. Sounds like an older man, kind of gravelly, like he's been smoking unfiltered cigarettes his whole life. He always starts off the same way. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Charlie looking for westbound Mac. You out there, Mac? over. The first time that I heard it, I thought nothing of it. Truckers use the CB to chat all the time, helps keep us awake. But then another voice answers, younger but still male, saying, "This is westbound Mac, I read you, Charlie. What's your 20, over." And that's when things get weird. They start having this conversation that sounds completely normal at first. Weather, road conditions, usual trucker talk. But if you listen long enough, you realize they're talking about landmarks and highways that do not exist, towns that aren't on the map, and the conversation always circles around to the same thing, a terrible accident that's about to happen. "You watch yourself coming through Dayton tonight, Mac," Charlie will say. "Bad wreck coming, 17 vehicles, only 2 survivors." "When's it happening, Charlie?" Mac will ask. And Charlie always says, "Already happened, son, 30 years ago tonight. I was there, you were there." And then the static takes over and you can't hear anything else. Here's the thing, I've tried to respond to them, so have other drivers. They never acknowledge us like we're not even there. I've asked state troopers about bad accidents near Dayton, but nothing matches what Charlie describes. So one night about 3 years ago, I was driving through a bad storm near the Ohio and West Virginia border when the conversation came through. Listening to it gave me the creeps as usual, but I had more important things to worry about, like the sheets of rain reducing visibility to almost nothing. That's when Charlie's voice came through clearer than I had ever heard it before. "Eastbound rig, mile marker 221, this is Charlie. You need to pull right over now, driver. Right now." He was talking to me. I was eastbound and I had just passed mile marker 220. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. "Eastbound driver, I'm not playing games. Pull over in the next quarter mile or you won't make it home." Something in his voice made me listen. I slowed down and eased onto the shoulder, putting my hazards on. Less than a minute after I stopped, lightning struck a tree about 100 yards ahead of me. The whole thing came crashing down across the highway right where I would have been if I hadn't stopped. I sat there shaking and then grabbed my CB. "Charlie, this is the eastbound driver. I don't know how you knew, but thank you." No response, just static. This happened last winter and it still bothers me when I think about it. I was hauling a load up through the eastern part of the state, taking the scenic route on Highway 93 instead of the interstate. It was getting late and a snowstorm was picking up. The weather report hadn't called for anything serious, but you know how Ohio winters can be, unpredictable. By 9 p.m., the snow was coming down so hard that I could barely see 20 feet in front of me. I needed to stop and wait it out. That's when I saw the lights of what looked like a truck stop up ahead. Not one that I recognized, but beggars can't be choosers in a blizzard. I pulled in and was surprised to see about 6 other trucks parked there. The place looked old but well maintained. One of those mom and pop operations that have mostly disappeared with the big chains all taking over. The sign said Halliday's Rest Stop, which didn't ring any bells, but again, I didn't care as long as they had coffee and a bathroom. Walking in, I got an odd feeling right away. The place was clean and warm with a small diner section and a convenience store area. 1950s music played softly from speakers somewhere. But what struck me was that despite the trucks outside, there were only 2 people in the place. A middle-aged waitress behind the counter and 1 customer, an older man in a flannel shirt sitting at the counter. "Evening," the waitress said with a smile. Her name tag read Doris. "Just you." I nodded, stamping snow from my boots. "Nasty out there, it came out of nowhere." "Always does," she said, pouring coffee without asking if I wanted anything. "The special tonight is meatloaf." I thanked her and took a seat at the booth, a few spots away from the man at the counter. The whole place had this weird vibe, like I had stepped back in time. No Wi-Fi password displayed, no TV. Even the prices on the menu seemed too low. The old man at the counter caught me looking around and nodded at me. First time at Halliday's. Yeah, I said, I don't usually come up this way. He chuckled. Oh, none of us plan to. Storms always bring us in. Something about the way that he said it made my skin crawl. I tried to focus on my menu, but I could feel him watching me. The waitress brought my coffee and I ordered the meatloaf special. While I waited, I pulled out my phone to check the weather. No signal, not even one bar. Oh, phone won't work here, honey, Doris said as she passed by. Never does. I ate quickly, keeping to myself. The food was good, really good actually, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about this place. The old man kept stealing glances at me, and I noticed that he wasn't actually eating, just nursing the same cup of coffee. When I finished, I asked for my check. That'll be $8.50, Doris said. Cash only. I paid, leaving a generous tip. Something told me that I should stay on her good side. You stay in the night? She asked, making change. In my sleeper, I said. Storm should pass through by morning. She gave me an odd look. It might be best to move on now. A road to the east clears up about 5 miles out. The old man spoke up then. She's right. Best not stay too long at Halliday's your first time around. Some folks never leave. I thanked them both, thoroughly creeped out by now, and headed back to my truck. The snow was still coming down hard, but something made me take their advice. I started up my rig and pulled out, heading east as Doris had suggested. Sure enough, 5 miles down the road, the snow just suddenly stopped, like driving through a curtain. 1 minute a blizzard, the next, clear skies and stars. I pulled over at the first chain gas station I saw and went inside to ask about Halliday's. The cashier, a young guy with a patchy beard, looked confused. Halliday's on 93? Man, that place burned down like 30 years ago. Old man Halliday and his wife died in the fire. What? I said. That's impossible. I was just there. I had dinner. There were other trucks. He shrugged. I don't know what to tell you. There's nothing there now but a concrete pad and some ruins. Been that way since before I was born. I didn't believe him. I got back in my truck the next morning and drove back that way in daylight. Found the turnoff where I had pulled in the night before. There was nothing there. Just a cracked concrete foundation, some charred wooden beams, and a rusted sign barely legible through decades of weathering. Halliday's rest stop. No other trucks, no diner, no Doris. I've asked other truckers about it since then. A few, very few, have had similar experiences. Always during unexpected snowstorms, and always the same descriptions of Doris and the old man. Always the warning not to stay too long. I don't take Highway 93 anymore if I can help it, especially not in the winter. This one still gives me chills because unlike some of the other stories I've told you, I've never found anybody else who's experienced anything similar. It happened to me and only me as far as I know. About 4 years ago, I was driving a late-night run down State Route 33 heading southeast from Columbus toward the West Virginia border. It was April, mild weather, clear skies with a full moon, perfect driving conditions. Around 1 a.m., I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. Nothing unusual about that except they seemed to be gaining on me fast. Within a minute, there was a car right on my tail, so close that I couldn't even see its headlights anymore, just the glow reflecting off my trailer. Now any trucker will tell you that this is dangerous as hell. If I had to brake suddenly, whoever was behind me would go right under my trailer, a death sentence for them. I tapped my brakes lightly, just enough to make my taillights flash as a warning, but the car didn't back off. I increased my speed a little, thinking they would pass me when the passing lane opened up. Soon enough, the lane widened, but the car stayed right on my tail. By this point, I was getting annoyed. I sped up to 70, over the limit for a truck my size, but they still clung to my back end. In the moonlight, I could just make out the shape in my mirrors. It looked like an older model car, maybe from the 70s, big and boxy. I couldn't see the driver. This went on for about 20 minutes. Every time the road opened to 2 lanes, I expected them to pass, but they never did. Just maintained that uncomfortably close distance, perfectly matching my speed. Finally, I decided to pull into the next rest stop and let them go around. There was one coming up in a few miles, so I put on my signal early to make my intentions clear. The moment that my blinker went on, the car finally backed off a little bit. I pulled into the rest area completely empty at that hour, and I watched my mirror expecting the car to continue down the highway. Instead, it followed me in. At this point, I was starting to get concerned. Road rage is somebody looking to hijack my cargo. I reached for the baseball bat that I kept in my cab just to be safe. The car parked about 50 feet behind my truck. In my mirror, I could see that it was indeed an old sedan, a Chevy Capri from the 70s, dark green or maybe blue, hard to tell in the moonlight. The driver's door opened and a man got out. Even from that distance, something seemed off about him. He moved stiffly, mechanically, like his joints didn't bend quite right. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a suit, and he just stood there beside his car staring at my truck. I wasn't about to get out and confront him. I decided to just pull back onto the highway and continue my route. I started my engine, but before I could put it into gear, my CB radio crackled to life.
"Driver, this is a message for you,"
came a voice through the static. It was flat and emotionless, with a slight metallic quality that didn't sound quite human. I hesitated and then picked up the handset. "Who is this?"
"I've been following you, driver,"
the voice replied. My blood ran cold. "What do you want?" I asked, watching the figure in my mirror. He hadn't moved, still standing perfectly still beside his car.
"To warn you, you will reach a bridge in 17 miles. Do not cross it."
What? Why? But no response came. The CB went silent. In my mirror, I watched as the man got back into his car with those same stiff, unnatural movements. He started his engine, backed up, and drove out of the rest area, continuing down Route 33. I sat there for a good 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to call the police, but what would I say? Some guy followed me, knew my name, and told me to not cross a bridge. They would think that I was drunk or high. Eventually, I pulled myself together and got back on the road. As I drove, I counted down the miles, a feeling of dread growing with each passing marker. Whatever bridge that he was talking about would be coming up soon. At mile 16, I saw it in the distance, a small bridge spanning a creek, nothing special. As I approached, I noticed something on the bridge, flashing lights. As I got closer, I could make out police cars, an ambulance, and a tow truck. I slowed down as I reached them. A state trooper waved me to a stop. "What happened?" I asked him, rolling down my window. "Drunk driver crashed through the guardrail about an hour ago. Car's down in the creek. Still working on getting the body out." "What kind of car?" I asked, already knowing the answer somehow. "An old Chevy Capri, I think. 70s model, dark blue." I thanked him and drove on, my hands shaking on the wheel. I've spent countless hours trying to figure out what had happened that night. The same car that followed me had already crashed and the driver was dead. Was I being warned by what? The driver's ghost? Some kind of anomaly? I've driven Route 33 many times since then. I've never seen that car again, never heard that voice on my CB. But I always make sure to slow down when I get to that bridge, half expecting to see those headlights in my mirror again. When you've been driving trucks for as long as I have, you develop a kind of sixth sense about deliveries. You can tell when something's not right about a shipment. Maybe the paperwork seems off or the location doesn't match the type of cargo. 9 times out of 10, there's a simple explanation, but sometimes things just don't add up. This particular incident happened about 5 years ago in the middle of a brutal January cold snap. I was given a last-minute assignment to deliver a single shipping container to an address on Chestnut Hill Road, about 30 miles outside of Columbus. A few things struck me as odd right from the start. First, the paperwork was vague about the contents, just listed it as medical equipment. Second, the shipment was given priority status, meaning that I was to deliver it as soon as possible, regardless of regular hours. And third, the delivery location wasn't a hospital or a medical facility. The address corresponded to what seemed to be an abandoned factory in the middle of nowhere. I questioned my dispatcher about it, but he just said the client had paid a premium for fast and discreet delivery, and that all the paperwork was in order. Times were tough for the company back then, and we had just lost a major contract, so I figured we were taking whatever jobs that we could get. I picked up the container from a nondescript warehouse in Cincinnati. It was sealed, which wasn't unusual, but what caught my attention was the weight of it. Far lighter than what you would expect for a container that size filled with medical equipment. I also noticed that it was refrigerated, maintaining a constant 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The drive started normally enough. It was around 9 p.m. when I set out, with an estimated arrival time of around midnight. The roads were relatively clear despite the recent snowfall, and I made good time heading northeast. About halfway through the journey, my truck's electronics started acting up. The GPS flickered on and off, the radio jumped between stations, and even my digital dashboard display glitched occasionally. I chalked it up to the cold weather affecting the electronics, and I kept on driving. As I got closer to the destination, the roads became increasingly remote and poorly maintained. The last 10 miles were on an unplowed, single-lane road that didn't look like it had seen traffic in weeks. My headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating nothing but dense forest on either side. I finally arrived at the address at around 12:30 a.m. The factory turned out to be an enormous concrete building that looked like it had dated back to the 1940s or earlier. No signs indicated what it had once been used for. There were no other vehicles in sight, no lights except for a single bulb above what appeared to be the loading dock, and no people, just this massive dark structure in the middle of a forest. I pulled up to the loading dock and called the contact number that I had been given. A man answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting by the phone.
"You've arrived,"
he said. Not a question, but a statement. "Yes, I have a delivery of medical equipment," I replied.
"Leave the container at the dock. Somebody will unload it."
"I need a signature for delivery confirmation," I said, following protocol. A long pause.
"Wait in your vehicle. Somebody will come out."
I sat in my truck for nearly 15 minutes. The temperature had dropped to well below zero, and an unnatural silence hung in the air. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just dead silence in the biting cold. Finally, the door to the loading dock opened. 3 men emerged, all wearing what looked like hazmat suits without the helmets. They moved with practiced efficiency, barely acknowledging me as they began to work on opening the container. One of them approached my window. Up close, I could see his face was gaunt, with dark circles under bloodshot eyes. "A delivery confirmation," I said, holding out the digital pad that we used for signatures. He signed it quickly. "You saw nothing here tonight," he said, handing the pad back. "But what is this place?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. He stared at me for a moment. "Research facility, government contract. That's all you need to know." I nodded, but as I was putting the pad away, I glanced toward the container. The other 2 men had opened it, and I caught a glimpse of what was inside before they moved to block my view. It wasn't medical equipment. The container was filled with what looked like large, cylindrical tanks, each about the size of a person arranged in rows. They were frosted over, clearly keeping whatever was inside very cold, and there were cables, dozens of them, connecting each tank to what appeared to be a monitoring equipment. The man at my window noticed me looking. "Leave now, forget what you've seen." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. I put my truck in gear and started to pull away. As I did, I caught one final glimpse in my side mirror. They were unloading one of the tanks and condensation was pouring off of it like fog. For just a second, I thought I saw something moving inside, pressing up against the glass. I drove away as fast as was safe on that icy road. About a mile from the facility, my GPS suddenly came back online and all my electronics returned to normal. I made it back to my home that night. Since then, I haven't had any other assignments to that location, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Now everybody's heard of the Moonville Tunnel down in Vinton County. It's an old railroad tunnel with all the ghost stories attached to it. But there's another tunnel, less well known, that sits abandoned along an old mining railroad track in eastern Ohio. No tourist websites mention it, no ghost hunters visit it. It doesn't even have a name that I've ever heard. It's just there, forgotten by almost everyone. I wouldn't have known about it either if my GPS hadn't sent me on a detour down a country road that passed near it about 6 years ago. I was hauling a load from Cleveland to Marietta, and there had been a bad accident on the highway that shut down all southbound lanes. The GPS recalculated and sent me on what it promised was the fastest alternative route. The route quickly deteriorated from a paved county road to a gravel path barely wide enough for my rig. I was about to turn around when my GPS insisted that I was only 3 miles from a main road that would take me back to the highway. Deciding that going forward was better than backing up on the narrow road, I pressed on. And that's when I saw it. A stone archway emerging from the hillside, almost completely overgrown with vegetation. I would have missed it entirely if not for the setting sun hitting it at just the right angle. It was clearly man-made, an old railroad tunnel from the looks of it. I would have just driven past and forgotten about it, but my truck chose that moment to sputter out and die. The engine cut out completely without warning. I tried to restart it, but nothing happened. No response at all, like somebody had disconnected the battery. It was getting dark out, and I had no cell phone service out here. I decided to try walking to find a signal, thinking that I would head toward where the main road was supposed to be. I grabbed my flashlight, locked my truck, and I started walking. Something drew me toward the tunnel first. Professional curiosity, I told myself. I had never seen an abandoned tunnel up close before. As I approached, I could see that it was in bad shape. The stone archway was crumbling and part of the tunnel appeared to have collapsed about 20 feet in. Railroad ties rotted on the ground, the steel rails long since removed. I shined my flashlight inside. Cool air flowed out, carrying a musty mineral smell. Nothing unusual for an old tunnel. I was about to turn away when I heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, coming from inside. "Help, please." I froze. It sounded like a child's voice. A young boy, maybe 8 or 10 years old. "Hello?" I called out. "Who's there?" No response. I hesitated and then stepped into the tunnel entrance, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The collapse that I had seen from outside had blocked about half the tunnel width, leaving a narrow passage along the right side. "Is somebody in here? Do you need help?" I called out louder this time. "Help me, I'm stuck." The voice came again from somewhere behind the collapse. Every instinct told me to go back to my truck and wait for another vehicle to pass by. This was how horror movies started. But if there really was a kid trapped in there? I squeezed past the collapsed section, careful not to disturb any loose rocks. Beyond it, the tunnel continued for maybe another 100 feet before ending in a solid wall of fallen stone and dirt. A complete cave-in. "Where are you at?" I called out, scanning the walls and floor with my flashlight. No sign of anyone. "I'm here, behind the wall." The voice was clearer now, definitely coming from beyond the cave-in. "They left me here." "Who left you? How long have you been in there?" I asked, approaching the wall of debris cautiously. "They left me after the collapse. They couldn't reach me." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cool air. This didn't feel right. I knew that I should leave. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't a child in immediate danger, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity, compassion, or maybe just the strange pull of the place. I don't think that I can help you. This collapse is massive. You can. The voice insisted, taking on an oddly persuasive tone that didn't sound childlike anymore. Just move a few rocks and make an opening. I can squeeze through a small space. I noticed something then that made my blood run cold. While the voice was talking about squeezing through, my flashlight beam caught movement in the wall of debris. The dirt between some of the rocks was shifting. It was bulging outward slightly as if something on the other side was pressing against it. "What are you?" I whispered. The voice changed, dropping any pretense of being a child. It became deeper with an unnatural resonance that seemed to vibrate through the stones themselves. "Somebody who has waited a very long time for company. Let me out. Let me ride with you, trucker. The things I could show you on the road at night." The bulging dirt moved again, more forcefully this time. Small stones shifted and fell away from the wall. Something dark began to seep through the spaces between the rocks, not water or mud, but something that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight rather than reflect it. I turned and ran, squeezing back through the partial collapse and not stopping until I had made it back to my truck. To my shock, it started immediately when I turned the key, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it. As I pulled away, I glanced in my mirror. In the fading daylight, I could see a figure standing at the tunnel entrance, small, like a child from a distance, but its proportions were all wrong. Its too thin arms were too long. It raised one elongated hand as if waving goodbye. Most truck drivers in Ohio have had close calls with deer. They're everywhere, especially during rutting season when the bucks lose whatever sense of self-preservation they normally have. You get used to scanning the tree lines at dusk and dawn, watching for that telltale movement, the flash of eyes reflecting your headlights. What happened to me on Route 13 near Mansville was different though. It was early November, peak season for deer vehicle collisions. I was hauling a load of paper products up to a distribution center, making good time despite the intermittent fog that had settled in the low-lying areas. The road there cuts through some pretty dense forest with steep embankments on either side in places. Not much room to maneuver if something runs out in front of you. Around 5:30 in the morning, just before sunrise, the fog had thickened considerably. I slowed down to about 45 miles per hour, high beams cutting through the murky gray as best they could. And that's when I saw it. A massive buck standing right in the middle of my lane, maybe 50 yards ahead. I hit the brakes, not slamming them because that's asking for a jackknife, but firmly. The truck slowed and I laid on the horn, hoping to scare the animal out of the way. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring directly at my approaching truck. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It was the biggest whitetail buck that I had ever seen, maybe a 14-pointer with a rack spread wider than my shoulders. But something was wrong with it. Even through the fog, I could see its hide wasn't the healthy brown that you would expect. It was patchy with areas that looked almost bare, like flesh without skin. I was down to about 30 miles per hour now, still closing distance and still blaring my horn. Any normal deer would have bolted long ago. This one did finally move, but not to run away. It lowered its head, pointing that massive rack of antlers directly at my truck, and it pawed at the ground like it was going to charge. I swerved, taking my rig halfway onto the shoulder. A dangerous move, but better than hitting something that size. As the cab of my truck passed the deer, I got a clear look at it through my side window. What I saw doesn't make sense even now. The deer's face wasn't a deer's face, not entirely. Parts of it looked almost human. The eyes especially spaced wrong and the wrong color. A deep reddish brown that caught the light from my headlights and seemed to glow from within. And its mouth. Deer don't have lips that can pull back into what I can only describe as a grin. I kept driving, shaken but telling myself that I had just seen a diseased animal, maybe suffering from chronic wasting disease or some other condition that affected its appearance and behavior. And then I checked my side mirror and saw it running after my truck. Not alongside the road, as you might expect from a startled deer, but directly behind me, in my lane, galloping at a speed that no deer should be capable of. I was back up to almost 50 miles per hour at this point, and it was keeping pace. I watched, horrified as it gained on me. In the red glow of my taillights, its appearance seemed to shift, sometimes looking like a normal deer and sometimes like something else entirely. Its proportions all wrong. The antlers, massive to begin with, looked even larger now, almost like branches of a tree spreading out in impossible directions. I floored it, pushing my rig as fast as I dared on the foggy road. For about a minute the deer kept pace, staying right behind my trailer. But then the road curved and I lost sight of it momentarily. When the road straightened out again, it was gone. I spent the rest of that drive white-knuckling the steering wheel, obsessively checking my mirrors every few seconds. I made it to the distribution center just as the sun was coming up, and I've never been so glad to see a loading dock in my life. I didn't tell anybody what I had seen. Who would believe me? A deer with a human face chasing a semi at highway speeds. I would sound insane, but I kept my eyes open for news reports or maybe somebody else that had seen it. Or maybe that there had been an accident involving a strange animal. Nothing. But over the next few months, I heard stories from other truckers, all in the same general area, all involving a deer that didn't look right or acted strange. One driver described a buck that stood on its hind legs as his truck passed by. Another swore that he saw one with too many legs and moving through the forest like a spider. Local hunters tell stories too if you get them talking after a few beers. They talk about deer they've tracked that left human-like footprints, about finding bucks with antlers so twisted that it isn't right, about hearing whispers from the tree line when field dressing their kills. In the years that have followed, I've heard from locals that they call that stretch of road Wendigo Road now. They say it's best not to drive it alone. I don't talk much about this one, but I will for you guys. Some things you just try to put behind you, file them away in that part of your brain labeled "don't open." But since I'm telling these stories, I might as well include the one that still wakes me up in a cold sweat some nights. 7 years ago, I was hauling a load of construction materials from Columbus to a site in Jackson, a smaller town in the southeastern part of the state. It was early March and we had had a weird weather pattern. Warm enough to melt the snow during the day and cold enough to freeze everything solid at night. Perfect conditions for black ice. I was ahead of schedule due to arrive at around 3 a.m. The road into Jackson winds through hills with a series of sharp curves and a bridge crossing over a deep ravine about 5 miles before you make it to town. As I approached that section, I slowed down to about 40 miles per hour, knowing the conditions might be treacherous. It was a clear night, a quarter moon providing just enough light to see the outlines of the hills against the sky. The bridge appeared around a bend, an old steel truss structure that had probably been there since the 1930s. As my headlights hit it, I saw something that made my chest tighten. A car on the bridge, sideways, its headlights pointing toward the guardrail. I immediately hit the brakes, pumping them to avoid locking up. My trailer started to fishtail slightly on the slick surface, but I managed to keep it under control. I was still about 100 yards from the bridge, slowing down rapidly. And that's when I saw the other headlights. Another car approaching the bridge from the opposite direction. I remember thinking, they're not going to see that stalled car in time. I laid on my horn, flashed my lights, anything to warn the approaching driver, but it was too late. The oncoming car hit a patch of ice just before the bridge skidded and slammed into the stalled vehicle at full speed. The impact sent both cars crashing through the guardrail. I managed to bring my rig to a stop about 50 feet from the bridge. I grabbed my flashlight and phone and ran toward the scene, already dialing 911. But as I reached the bridge, I realized with horror that the guardrail was intact. There were no cars, no sign of an accident at all. I stood there confused and shaken. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I more tired than I thought? The 911 operator answered and I hesitated before telling her I thought that I had seen an accident but might have been mistaken. She took my information and said that she would send a deputy to check it out anyway. I waited on the bridge for about 20 minutes until a sheriff's deputy arrived. He got out of his cruiser, flashlight in hand. "You reported an accident?" he asked, scanning the bridge with his light. I thought I saw 2 cars crash through the guardrail," I said, feeling foolish now. "But when I got here, there was nothing." He nodded and not looking partially surprised. "Where exactly did you think you saw them go over?" I pointed to a section of the guardrail on the north side of the bridge. "Right there. One car was stopped sideways on the bridge and another one hit it." The deputy walked to the spot and shined his light down into the ravine, and then he turned to me with an odd expression. "There is a car down there. Looks like it's been there a while though, probably not what you saw." My skin crawled. I joined him at the railing and peered down. Sure enough, about 40 feet below, I could make out the rusted remains of what looked like an older car, half submerged in the creek bed. "That's been there since before my time," the deputy said. "Accident back in the 90s, I think. They recovered the bodies but couldn't get the car out without specialized equipment. Department decided it wasn't worth the expense." I stood there trying to process what I had seen or thought that I had seen. "Do you get many accidents on this bridge?" The deputy hesitated before answering. "More than our share. This bend ice up pretty bad in the winter. We've had 3 fatal crashes here in the past decade. All of them on March 7th, strangely enough." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What's today's date?" "March 7th, he replied, giving me a knowing look. "You're not the first person to report seeing an accident here when there wasn't one. Happens just about every year on this date." He must have seen the color drain from my face because he added, "Local legend says it echoes of the first accident back in '63. That one was bad. Station wagon full of kids and a semi-truck. 7 fatalities in total." "The truck driver?" I asked, already knowing the answer somehow. "Only survivor," the deputy confirmed. "Lived another 40 years with the guilt, apparently. Locals say that he comes back every year trying to prevent it from happening again." I thanked the deputy for his time and returned to my truck badly shaken. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or time loops or whatever you want to call it, but I know what I saw. Those headlights, the impact, the cars going over the guardrail that showed no damage afterward. It was all as real as anything that I've ever seen. I completed my delivery in Jackson that night, and I've had trips through there since. I always take a different road now, adding an hour to my drive if need be. The locals think it's because of the curves and the ice. I'll let them think that. But every year on March 7th, I think about that bridge and I wonder if some other driver is seeing those phantom headlights, hearing the crash that never happens in our time, feeling the helplessness of watching a tragedy you can't prevent. GPS is both a blessing and a curse for truck drivers. It can save your butts when you're trying to find an obscure delivery location, but it also can lead you straight into trouble. Low bridges, weight-restricted roads, or neighborhoods where an 18-wheeler has no business being. I learned to be skeptical of GPS directions early in my career, but even I couldn't have anticipated where it would lead me one foggy night in late October about 4 years ago. I was hauling a partial load from Zanesville to Cambridge, taking smaller state and county roads instead of doubling back to the interstate. It was around 10 p.m. and a heavy fog had settled into the valleys, limiting visibility to maybe 30 feet in some places. I was relying heavily on my GPS, taking it slow and carefully watching for signs at each turn. About halfway through the journey, the GPS instructed me to turn onto County Road 793. I did, noting that the pavement quickly deteriorated to a chip and seal surface barely wide enough for my rig. I slowed to a crawl, questioning whether I should turn around, but the GPS insisted this was the right way. After about 3 miles of this, the road curved sharply as I rounded the bend. The fog suddenly lifted. Like driving through a curtain, I emerged into a clear patch where I could see the night sky, stars shining brightly overhead. Below them sat a town that I had never seen before, maybe 24 buildings lining a main street, and a few residential streets branching off of it. The architecture looked old, early 1900s style, but everything was immaculately maintained. Streetlights cast a warm yellow glow over empty sidewalks. A sign at the town's edge read, "Welcome to Roscoe, population 312. I had never heard of Roscoe, but Ohio has plenty of tiny towns that don't make it onto most maps. My GPS showed that I was still on the road with no town indicated, but that wasn't unusual for older and smaller places. As I drove slowly down the main street, I noticed something odd. There were no people visible anywhere, despite several businesses appearing to be open. The local diner had lights on, and I could see place settings on the tables through the windows. The small movie theater's marquee advertised The Last Picture Show with now playing beneath it, though the film was from the 1970s. Even the gas station looked operational. Price sign showing gasoline at $1.32 per gallon, a price that I hadn't seen in 20 years. I needed fuel and figured this was as good a place as any to stop. I pulled into the gas station, which thankfully had a layout spacious enough for my rig. When I shut off my engine, I was struck by the absolute silence. No distant traffic noise and no music from nearby buildings, not even insects or the wind. Just complete, unnatural quiet. I got out and approached the pumps. They were older but looked functional. No card readers, though apparently this was a pay-inside establishment. I walked to the store entrance, noting that my footsteps seemed abnormally loud in the stillness. Through the windows, I could see the interior was lit and looked fully stocked, but there was no attendant visible at the counter. The door opened with a cheerful bell jingle that made me jump in the silence. Inside, rows of snacks, drinks, and basic automotive supplies lined the shelves, all with packaging that looked like it was from the 1990s. Behind the counter, a coffee pot sat full on a burner, steam rising gently from it. "Hello?" I called out. "Anybody working?" No response. I walked the aisles, increasingly uneasy. Everything looked normal except for the dated products and the complete absence of people. No security cameras and no modern touchscreen registers, just an old mechanical cash register on the counter. Next to it sat a local newspaper. I picked it up looking for a date. The masthead read, "The Roscoe Register," with the date of October 17th, 1997, and a headline about the local high school football team's homecoming victory. That was over 20 years ago. I put the paper down, suddenly eager to leave. Whatever was going on here was not right, and I didn't want to be a part of it. I hurried back to my truck and started the engine, relieved when it turned over normally. As I pulled out of the gas station, I noticed movement in my side mirror, the first sign of life that I had seen in the town. A man stood in the entrance to the gas station watching me. He wore what looked like a mechanic's uniform, dark blue with a name patch that I couldn't read from that distance. Even from here, I could tell something was off about his appearance. He stood too still, and though I couldn't make out his features clearly, I had the distinct impression that he was smiling broadly. He raised one hand in greeting or warning as I drove away. I accelerated down the main street, passing the diner and the theater again. This time I thought that I saw faces in the windows, just glimpses of pale ovals tracking my progress. My skin crawled as I pushed the speed well beyond what was safe for the road. At the town's edge where I had seen the welcome sign earlier, the fog still hung like a wall. I plunged into it, blind for several seconds, until my headlights again showed nothing but the poorly maintained country road ahead. I drove another 10 miles before my heartbeat returned to normal. When I reached a major intersection with highway signs that I recognized, I pulled over and checked my GPS and map apps. According to them, I had just traveled along Road 793, which ran uninterrupted between the two larger towns. No town named Roscoe. When I made it to my destination, I asked several locals about Roscoe. Most had never heard of it. One elderly man at the delivery site, however, gave me a strange look when I mentioned the name. Roscoe's been gone for decades. Whole town was condemned and evacuated after the chemical spill from the plant nearby. They were supposed to demolish it, but funding fell through. Last I heard, it's just a bunch of abandoned buildings slowly falling apart. How did you hear about it? I muffled something about seeing an old road sign, and I changed the subject. Later, I researched Roscoe online. There was indeed a small town by that name that had been evacuated in '97 after a chemical accident contaminated the groundwater. The few photos I found showed dilapidated and overgrown buildings, nothing like the pristine town that I had seen. According to the official records, the evacuation was completed on October 17th, 1997, the same date on the newspaper that I had seen. I don't know why I've been compiling these stories. Maybe it's therapeutic, a way to convince myself that I'm not crazy. Maybe it's just a warning to other drivers. Or maybe it's because some things need to be recorded and remembered, even if no one ever believes them. I've been on leave from driving for the past 3 months. The company calls it a stress leave, but both my dispatcher and I know that it's more than that. I have a handful of other stories that I might share with you in the future, but for now, I just want to get my mind off of things. Take my time not being on the road, just to relax and try to recuperate. Thank you all for listening. Stay safe out there.
Sendos Adrian, SWAT, Taki and Play, Raphael, Smiling Cat, Dragon Slayer 048, Ty Screaming, Malcolm Black, Slavey Shroomy, Nelson Asada, Sanjay Anthem, Dala Magara, Jimmy Griffin, Caden Gibbler, Kathy McGuire, MP Massacre 91, Justin Foamauer, Dino, Takio Zerla, Deggy, Jerry Rainey, Miss Eldridge,